Las Vegas, Nevada, and I have the pleasure today of introducing two very esteemed speakers here and talk today about the role of interpretation. Our first one is Jim Covel. Did I pronounce that correctly? Yep. And Jim is the president of the National Association of Interpretation. He is the senior manager of guest experience at Monterey Bay Aquarium. Before that, he was the district ranger at the Sacramento County for 12 years. And also, previous to that, he worked for the Wildlife Department of UC Davis for 6 years. Jim also has a very interesting personal story that he'll be sharing with you about how he grew up on a wildlife refuge. So he has some very close connections with wildlife refuges. Tim Merriman has a BS in zoology, a secondary teaching certificate, an MA in Master's in Aquatic Ecology, and a PhD in speech from Southern Illinois University. He has served as the executive director of the National Association for Interpretation since 1995. During his 42-year career, Tim has traveled in 20 nations around the world to train interpretive planners and trainers. He co-authored with Lisa Brochu, Personal Interpretation, Connecting Your Audience to Heritage Resources, The Management of Interpretive Sites, The History of Heritage Interpretation in the United States, and Put the Heart Back in Your Community. So please join me in welcoming these two speakers today.
Thank you. Is this on? Are we working okay?
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Angelina. We're going to wander. We're not good at staying on a dais and behind a table. So first of all, I'd like to ask you, how many of you already know what NAI is? Okay, quite a few of you. Just would tell you, we just hit a record number of members. We're up above 5,360, 5,360 members in 30 nations. And what they have in common is they're all trying to connect people to nature and history. And it's a pleasure to be here. I do have to tell you a brief story. There was a rancher who went to church one Sunday morning in Colorado, and we're in Fort Collins, Colorado with our national office. And he showed up. He was the only one in the audience at church. The pastor came out and he said, "You're the only one here, brother. I guess there's no sense in preaching." And he says, "Well, when only one cow shows up in the morning, I still feed it." And he said, "Well, if you feel that way, okay." And so he started preaching. He went on 20 minutes, then 30 minutes, then 45 minutes, and then 50 minutes. Finally, he wound down and he went back out to the rancher. And he said, "I really got into it today, didn't I, brother?" He said, "Yeah." He says, "Preacher, when only one cow shows up, I don't feed him the whole load." We're not going to feed you the whole load today. In the amount of time we have available, we want to give you a taste of interpretation. And as we see it, I would tell you that I was at a Association of Public Gardens meeting a couple weeks ago in Philadelphia and gave a plenary presentation. And I asked some of the people in the audience, I said, "What is interpretation to you?" And they would say, "Signs, exhibits, brochures." And I was really aware they're identifying it as media. We want to give you a slightly different view of interpretation today and invite your questions at the end or during. If you have one during that's pressing, please don't wait to the end. We're willing to chat with you at any time. But I want to pose a question to you here. If we use interpretation effectively, we could teach people science and the facts, or change people's behavior, or influence their attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors towards stewardship. Now, you can frame what you think is the right answer amongst those right now. You notice there is no D, all of the above, or E, none of the above. And I'm going to turn it over to Jim to kind of frame what's the difference in education and interpretation?
All right, welcome, folks. And just along the way of kind of some of the things you'll see, for me, this topic goes way, way back to my childhood because I had an opportunity to grow up on the country's oldest waterfowl refuge. It'd be a good, I don't have any prizes to hand out. Anybody know what that happens to be? Established in 1870. Oh, I stumped everybody. Wow.
I have this
Oh, well, there we go. You'll be surprised. California. Bingo, Lake Merritt in Oakland, California, established by the California State Legislature in 1870. And at Lake Merritt, and the city of Oakland actually operated that facility, and there, the municipal naturalist was the refuge manager. So you had a dual role of running a waterfowl refuge and all the things that come with that in the heart of a large urban area. And the naturalist role was in connecting those resources to the rest of the population there in the city of Oakland, and everybody that came from really all over the world passed through there. And that person for over 35 years was my father. So I had a chance to grow up watching him in action with that dual role. And like the stories you've heard over and over again this week, just people that have inspired the rest of us to go into this line of work, and he was certainly my inspiration. So anyhow, I salted in a few photos here and there from my career and from some of the Lake Merritt days. And a lot of what I'm going to talk about is kind of based on my observations of watching how you can connect even urban dwellers who have a very, very thin connection, if at all, to wildlife resources, how you can connect those people better to the resources and make them true believers, and more importantly these days, big-time supporters of what you do. So, when we talk about interpretation, and when I tell people I'm an interpreter, the first question I usually get is, what language do you speak? And I struggle with English on some days, but really, I guess we do speak maybe the language of science and nature to an audience that doesn't understand that language very well some days. But just to clarify terms a little bit, we throw around the term education a fair amount, and earlier today you saw the kids that had participated in a year-long environmental education program, and that is pretty close to true education, where you have a structured curriculum and you have a long contact time with the audience. And education typically works very well, where you have that kind of structure to work with. And it tends to focus a little bit more on cognitive gain. We're trying to teach people things so they know more as a result of the process. Does that work for folks? Communication, and all of these things involve effective communication. Certainly interpretation, I think, really tries to use communications in a very efficient way so you get key messages across to people no matter what amount of contact time you have with them. Interpretation isn't necessarily language translation, but, and I was so excited when, did anybody see the movie The Interpreter that came out a few years ago? Yeah, didn't stay in the theaters for very long. I was so excited when that movie came out. So I thought, all right, they finally made a movie about us. But it wasn't. It was somebody does translation. Anyhow, interpretation really isn't language translation. However, if you think about what I just said, that we do in some ways translate the language of science and nature and culture and heritage to an audience that may understand that language less and less as the years go by. So what is interpretation? And this is the definition of interpretation that we arrived at through a process of 2 or 3 years working with a variety of other stakeholders in the interpretation business. I have to tell you, one of our key partners in that definitions project was the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And amongst other federal agencies and some other organizations, looking at all the different things that we could consider, this is what we came down to, and it's a very helpful way of looking at interpretation. And I'm going to dissect this just a little bit more as we go along. By the way, that's my dad standing at Lake Merritt with Roger Torrey Peterson, who liked to come by and gawk at the birds once in a while. And I have to tell you, he also used to sneak into the Monterey Bay Aquarium. I'd sneak him in before opening. He liked to go out into our aviary exhibit and photograph our shorebirds, so he had enough detail to work on some of his paintings. So in this definition of interpretation, interpretation is a mission-based communication process that forges emotional and intellectual connections between the interests of the audience and the meanings inherent in the resource. I want to point out a few key phrases here. Mission-based, absolutely, and that recognizes the organizations that sponsor the work that we do. You can interpret a wide variety of things. You need to make sure that it always relates back to the mission of the organization. And so that needs to be recognized right up front in the definition. Communication process that forges emotional connections. And and I guess I should apologize up front, because I'm really going to kind of harp on this a little bit, that emotional connection. I always think of the head and heart connection that we make with our audience. That emotional connection, we're finding more and more, is the real key to moving your audience. And maybe this is where interpretation differs a little bit from traditional education efforts, in that we're not only looking at the intellectual connection, but also making those emotional connections. And there's actually some very effective shortcuts to doing that. It's not nearly as hard as you think. There is, of course, the intellectual connection. People need to know about the resources that we work with. If you're not even aware of it, how can you take care of it? So that basic awareness, the basic understanding, the elements of that intellectual connection are very, very important. I don't mean to give that short shrift, but it shouldn't stop there. We need to make sure that we do the whole job, complete that head and heart connection, that we make emotional as well as intellectual connections between the interests of the audience. And this is, after all, an audience-driven process, not the interests of the interpreter. And sometimes the things that I'm fascinated with really are not what my audience is that excited about. And when it comes down to it, I have to go with the audience. So the interests of the audience, that means really focusing some attention on who our audience is. Talk a little bit about that in a few minutes as well. In the meanings inherent in the resource, not the minutia, the meanings. Our audience relies on us to take that vast information about the topic and distill it down to the real nuggets. They want to know the meaning. And actually, when you think about it, the meaning exists within the audience. Each one of us makes the meaning out of things that we encounter by connecting those new encounters, that novel information, to things that we already understand, appreciate, and value. That's how we make meaning. So our audience expects us to take, again, that universe of information, distill it down. What are the very few key things that we want everybody to walk away with? And then how do we help them make that relevant? How do we help them find the personal relevance in it so that they connect it to their lives and then it stays with them? Mission-based communication process that forges emotional and intellectual connections between the interests of the audience, the meanings inherent in the resource. You can remember that. That's probably the best checklist I've ever come across in terms of making sure the interpretation I'm doing is going to hit a home run every time. I told you there was a shortcut to making those emotional connections. Tim's going to show it to you right now.
I want to do a little activity with you that we do in our training courses, and I brought an object with me. You can see it up there on the screen, but I'm going to at least get it to some of the front rows here. If you'd give me one word, a trait, or a description of that.
It's tan in color.
Tan.
Smooth.
Smooth.
Hard.
Hard. So I've got tan, smooth, and hard. I'm going to stop there. I'm going to tell you a story about it. I ran a nature center in Pueblo, Colorado, and I brought about 10,000 grade school kids out a year for programs in Native American teepees. and we'd teach them Indian games and Indian history of the area. No Native Americans to speak of living in that area anymore, unfortunately. And it was a way of helping connect people with that part of the past of the Front Range of Colorado. Once a year, we'd bring donors out and feed them bison steaks cooked directly on the coals of a fire, and we would try to get them to donate money, because a lot of the kids in Pueblo came on the school lunch program. They came from lower income families. Lady came up to me after the program, because we would read Native American oratory to them to try to, all the world is a circle, you know, to try to get them to connect with what we were doing. She came up and handed me this. She said, "This is a gift." I said, "Well, what is it?" She said, "When I was 10 years old, my parents knew I was very ill. They took me to doctors, and doctor after doctor said I was terminally ill, that they were going to lose me. In frustration, they took me to a Native American shaman named Buckskin Charlie. Charlie handed me this rock, this hard yellow stone, tan stone, and said, "I removed that from the stomach of a deer I was cleaning." He said, "My people believe it has great power. Keep it with you, you'll have a long life." She said, "I'm 84. I've kept this with me all my life." Now, I said, "I think you really ought to give that to one of your grandchildren, not to me." She said, "I have. It keeps ending up back on the counter or in a drawer. To them, it's just a stone. It's a hard yellow stone." And she said, "I wanted to give it to someone who would keep the story. So I've kept the story." Cindy, if you'd give me one word, whatever it means to you after you hear the story.
Belief.
Belief.
Sacred.
Sacred.
Something very special.
Special. Now, I've gotten every answer under the sun with that, from spiritual, faith, hope, belief, healing, medicinal, to placebo. Those are all good answers. That's okay. We'll take that. And of course, if I ask people to give me the description, this is the intellectual stuff. This is the intellectual meanings of this. And I can get very technical about it if I happen to be an archaeologist, anthropologist, or paleontologist. I could tell you that it's a bezoar or a calculus. But when I go to the intangibles, the concepts, the big ideas, these are some of the other answers besides the ones you just gave that other people have given us. I want to make this point. First of all, that's Buckskin Charlie up on the right. He was the last traditional chief of the Southern Ute tribe. He took over after Chief Uray passed on, and he became the chief, and he modernized the tribe and created a tribal government and did a lot of wonderful things, but he was a shaman. And this whole story got me interested in his story and in the story of the Southern Ute. It was really interesting. When you think about how do you interpret this sort of thing, I can imagine putting this in a case at a archaeological site and saying, this is a calculus discovered that had been consumed by a grazing ungulate, a nucleus of material, then aggregated concentric layers of calcium around it, creating an object that would not pass through the that's the way we often interpret things. We're giving people kind of the things that interest us. If you really want to connect your audience to the stories at your refuge and at your places that you interpret, you have to choose universals, things that are in their experience. You've got to make it relate to something in their lives. When I tell people this story about, for this one woman, this represented faith and hope, life. It was a healing. It was a medicinal talisman. That is a true story about this stone. It's also valuable to learn the intellectual stuff, but the emotional part, the story, is what we interpret. And if you think about your site, you may be, on a daily basis, more engaged with the tangibles, the list on the left. How big is the lake? How many geese are on the lake? Where do they nest in winter? Where do they go, or in summer? Where do they go in winter? What do they eat? What impact do they have on the environment? That sort of thing. But the audience may be coming for that bigger connection to beauty, to landscapes and things of that sort. Jim, did you? Well, let's do the same here, yeah. Give me what you see as the tangibles. What do you get from the traits, the descriptions of this particular area? Anyone, if you'd sing it out and I'll repeat it. Peace? Peace, okay. Majestic. Lush. Beauty. Now, I asked you for a description, and you all went for the emotional side, the experiential side. I'm sure any of you could have said bull elk. You know that. But intellectually, even for those of us who are biologists, may have a very deep interest and very deep knowledge of wildlife, I would guess that, boy, I hope you still turn around when you're out there, even when you're banding ducks or doing something where you're doing a lot of work in a day, and you go, God, it's beautiful here. I'm so lucky to be here. This is where I spend my days. I'm not stuck behind a computer. And then, of course, some of you are going, I am stuck behind a computer. Jim.
So you've been hearing and observing throughout the conference just how today's audience and more importantly, the audience, the younger audience, the kids that are going to inherit this from us very soon, the kids that are going to be voters and decision makers very, very soon, that the nature of that audience is very different from what we may have been used to, and especially very different from the audience that was around when a lot of our refuge areas were set aside. And so just a little bit of a reality check in kind of who's today's young audience, kind of features of that audience. I happened to come across this. Anybody seen this Wildlife Refuge video game? Wow, just could be really cool, but I don't know. Looking at the cover, it just looks a little scary to me. So another little quiz. Got some numbers on the left and what those numbers mean on the right. So let's see. Let's start off with the number of hours on a computer per week. Five and a half hours. Now that's probably, and that may be very conservative. Number of hours playing video games per week. This is kind of the typical, actually this is for 6 to 12-year-olds. 6 to 12-year-olds. Number of hours playing video games per week, 3.5 hours. Number of hours reading books per week. Yeah, you got that one right. Number of hours watching TV per week, 16.5. So, obviously, today's audience, tomorrow's audience, remember this interpretation is an audience-driven process. This is where they're coming from. So, the good news is this audience is incredibly well tied in. They have access to huge amounts of information, but they get that information in whole new ways. Texting, IMing, blogging, tweeting, using wikis. I'm not making these things up. These words actually exist now, and they're in very common use. And the good news is, again, the millennials, as Juan called them, are in constant touch with each other. Communication is a big thing, just in a very different way. Access to an incredible amount of information. Nobody owns a set of encyclopedias anymore. It's really coming off the web. Podcasts, a lot of different social media sites. And the social media sites evolve so rapidly, it's hard to keep up with them. Boy, Flickr just isn't used much anymore. MySpace, boy, that's like so yesterday. Twitter is really big. And you've seen this in action throughout the conference. And it's a great way to reach an audience, but a very new way for a lot of us. And of course, increasingly, this younger audience is more and more urbanized, spend more time indoors, a lot less time outdoors. Talked about that whole nature deficit disorder that a lot of parents are afraid to let their kids go outdoors anymore. When I think of growing up in East Oakland, boy, my parents had, of course, my dad was a park naturalist, but spent a lot of time out running around the parks in Oakland and never thought anything more about it. Today, my parents wouldn't allow their kids to step outside. Also, this generation is very heavily influenced by the media, and a real key thing to pay attention to. There's some good news here. Because of the exposure to lots of information, so many self-directed kinds of opportunities, that our younger audiences have a great deal of creativity and curiosity, and lots of ways to apply that. Talked about their access to information. They're incredibly well-informed. I'm amazed at the questions I get from very young children nowadays, and keep you on your toes, trying to keep up with them. They are very concerned about environmental issues. In fact, and you're all aware of that ecophobia phenomenon, it concerns me sometimes that I talk to kindergartners, first graders, who have a real command of things like climate change and pollution, marine plastics, issues like that, boy, when I was in kindergarten, those things, we weren't worried about that yet. And I want to put in a plug here for making sure when we work with younger audiences that the first thing we do is to make sure that we are building a great relationship with nature. Young children need to understand what a marvelous place this world is. They need to have a real positive relationship with nature. There is plenty of time later on to get into all the scary stuff. And we shouldn't get into that scary stuff until they get to, fourth grade or so is what I hear typically. Kids grow up so fast these days, maybe that's a dream. But need to make sure that children get off to a great start with nature before they hear about the scary stuff. But that access to information is making it very difficult to avoid that ecophobia phenomenon. But there's a lot of concern about environmental issues amongst the millennials. And they have this incredible network, this communication ability that's unprecedented in order to network with other people to really take meaningful action. And there's a lot of marketing, there's a lot of political campaigns that are built all around this. And we should be taking advantage of that capacity as well. Because of that isolation from nature, younger audiences find going out in nature something that we might find very commonplace. It's a very novel experience for them. So it has a real draw. You can have any kind of experience on a virtual basis. Your computer, you can travel any place on the planet, you can see remarkable things. But when you're present in person for the real thing, that is very novel. And that's one thing that we have that's a remarkable asset, is we provide genuine firsthand experiences with nature. Don't ever underestimate the power of that. It's more powerful than ever before. Coupled with that, incredible appreciation for other living things. And again, that's another ace that we have, wildlife refuges, and whether it's insects, fishes, waterfowl, big game, whatever we have to share, introducing urban people to other living things. Again, very novel, very powerful experience. In some polling that we've done the last couple of years in California, and I know California is different than a lot of other places, and most of you are probably thankful for that. But just as an indication, when we do polling on what audience segments in California, what population segments are supportive of conservation measures in balloting. The most supportive audience segment in our state are young male Hispanic voters. And how many of us are playing to these new audience segments? How many of us are building relationships with these non-traditional audiences that are going to be the basis for our support in the not too distant future? I've been a part of what we used to call the hook and bullet crew for my whole life, and hunted and fished my entire life. But I have to tell you that when I look around, especially in California, there are fewer and fewer people like me and more folks that love refuges, love wild places and wildlife, but for very different reasons. And we need to start incorporating where they're coming from as well in our strategies to interpret these resources and build that constituency. In some audience research that we've done on who comes to places like, it started with zoos and aquariums, it's branched out to parks and visitor centers and nature centers. I don't know if this has been applied. In fact, I'm pretty sure it hasn't been applied yet to wildlife refuges. So I'll leave it to you. But I would propose that these audience types are present as part of your audience as well. This comes out of a study done just a very few years back on why zoos and aquariums matter. And the whole idea was, are we really fulfilling our mission in helping people adopt conservation behaviors? We'll get to the conservation behavior part in a minute. But an interesting pattern emerged. We found that there were 5 large categories of motivation that drove people to come to places that we operate. These were the categories. Let's take a closer look at each one of them. They were experience seekers, facilitators, hobbyists/professionals, the spiritual rechargers, and explorers. That doesn't mean anything yet, but they will in a second. Experience seekers. These are we've always called them the checklist tourists. These are folks that show up at a place because they heard from all their friends, they've read about it in magazines and brochures, they've seen photographs. It's like, wow, if you ever go to Monterey, you've got to go to the Monterey Bay Aquarium. You ever go to Willows, you've got to go to Sacramento National Wildlife Refuge. These are the busloads of people that show up at museums and zoos and aquariums, but they're also the people that show up at refuges that hear about the unique resources that you have. But they're kind of driven by, okay, what's the cool thing here? I've got 45 minutes, and then I got to head on to the next thing. They literally are working off a checklist, either in their mind or maybe they actually have a brochure. So you have a very short opportunity to connect with these people. The good news is they're going to go home and tell everybody else about all the places they went because they're in the network of checklist tourists. So they're a great avenue for promoting your facilities and your resources. The experience seekers. Facilitators. These are people that their satisfaction is tied into bringing somebody else to your place, and if that other person they brought has a great time, they have a great time. Mom and dad, when you bring your kids someplace, if the children are having a fabulous time, you're having a great time. You're the facilitator, and your satisfaction is directly tied to the satisfaction of the people that mean the most to you, that you brought along with you. So any family group, even any group of individuals that arrive at a refuge, if there's a social group there, one person said, hey, let's go here and see this. They're the facilitator. Everybody has a great time. They're having a great time. The professional/hobbyist. These are folks that have either a real avocation or maybe they have a professional interest in the resource, the place that you operate. So I rarely go any place without, if I'm going by a refuge, I go by. I go to look at birds. If it's during the hunting season, I like to look at their check station operation. I did that stuff for a little bit. If they have a visitor center, I go in and I look at the information that's shared, and I look at the exhibits. And if they have any, this is going to sound weird, but if they have any mounted specimens, I always look at the color of the eyes, because I worked in a museum for a little while, and I always like to make sure the waterfowl have the right color eyes for their, that's just my own little quirk. But, so these are folks where, and maybe they are hunters, maybe they're bird watchers, anglers, people that either it's a serious hobby, or maybe they are also in the business. They come by to check out your facility. And they often have very technical questions. So they're easy to spot because of the technical nature of the questions that they ask. The big group for us, the spiritual rechargers. These are folks, talk about that heart connection. These are people that already have a deep emotional connection to your place. Maybe it's the resource. It's different for a lot of folks. This is the group where they have a deep connection with you. You may not see them very often because they don't want to talk about it. They're not going to be present for programs. They don't want a lot of information. They're the ones that may come out there seeking solitude. They're the ones that may just want to go connect with wildlife. And the ones that may want to just stand up to their navel in a cold stream someplace and fling a fly at a fish. And it's a spiritual thing for them. It's that emotional connection. When you need help, when you want somebody to speak up, to help get the resources that you need, when you need somebody to defend what you do, this group will come to your aid every time. But it's hard to find them because we don't connect with them very often. So look for those rechargers. Find some way to develop a relationship with them. They can be some of your biggest allies. And finally, the explorers. And this particular group is very interested in learning more. They like novel experiences. They are constantly in search of information, and they're the ones that are often most engaged in interpretive programs or educational efforts, because they want to know more about the place, and they connect with the place by knowing more about it. So offering information, helping people explore more on their own, or in guided programs, really helps them connect a lot more. Each of these groups is there for a different reason, though, and recognizing that there are different reasons for people to come to your facility, you can target the experiences you're providing, target the programs you're providing to make sure that each one of them is going to find what they need there. We've been doing this a lot in zoos, aquariums, museums, nature centers. It really helps you connect a lot more effectively with the audience. So again, with interpretation, because it may not be, it's very efficient and effective, it's not structured as much as education. So it's a way that you can create very engaging experiences that people find meaningful, but allow it to be relevant to each individual, so they form their own relevance. Again, appealing to the novelty of interacting with nature and other living things. That's a huge asset that we have that I don't know if we make the most effective use of. It's really geared towards shorter interactions. Sometimes you're only talking to somebody for a minute and a half at a check station. Maybe you encounter them out on a trail for a few minutes. By focusing on key messages and ways to tie those messages in, often using the intangibles and universals that Tim talked about, we can make sure even a short time that people find meaning in that place, that they become attached to it. And that's when conservation really starts to take on a personal quality for people, when it's relevant, when they have a personal connection to the resource. Tim?
How many of you know who Freeman Tilden was? A few? He was a playwright. His parents owned newspapers in the Northeast United States. They wanted him to go to college, become a journalist, come back and be a newspaper man. Instead, he went to Europe and traveled around and kind of got the education to get on the ground. And he came back and he became a writer. And he wrote a book on national parks that became a bestseller in the 50s. And then Alfred Knopf, the publishing giant in New York City, asked him to write a book. Well, he asked him to write the book about national parks. Then the director of National Park Service said, could you write a book about interpretation? We've been doing it since the beginning of the Park Service. We really don't know how to capture it and describe it. And so he did. And so we got 6 principles out of that we call Tilden's Principles. And they've been updated, but by golly, they still stand true. In 1957, he published that. He took a phrase out of an old National Park Service manual through interpretation, understanding, through understanding, appreciation, through appreciation, protection. When he wrote that in 1957, there was no evidence that was true. It was intuitive to him. It tracked. It felt right. He doesn't know who originally wrote it in that Park Service administrative manual, but he plucked it out of there and said, I believe this. If you were to hear Sam Hamm, who's a professor at University of Idaho and a social science researcher and a cognitive psychologist speak, he would tell you that there's literally hundreds of studies that ratify this process. And if you look at we call this a social marketing hierarchy, or our own name for it is the interpretive continuum. We have people come to us that are curious, or maybe they're already fairly aware of the resource, or maybe they already understand it to some degree. And we try to move them up this continuum in whatever time we've got with them. And guess what? 90% of Americans in 1970, when polled, said, I am not an environmentalist. By year 2000, 90% were saying, I am an environmentalist. Where's an environmentalist? Well, they're saying they care about the resource. But in recent research, the Roper polls done on environmental education, they found that only 30% actually do anything that demonstrates that care about, the stewardship piece. They bought a Prius rather than a Cadillac, Coupe de Ville or whatever. They bought a house that was energy efficient or passive solar. They built a business that was LEED certified, that sort of thing. Only 30%. So we've had impact in the last 30 years, 40 years, but guess what? There's still a lot of folks that don't believe what we're talking about. So we're trying to move people up the stewardship continuum. By the way, there's a group there at the bottom called Dragged Along. I presume you've all been that. That's me when my wife wants to go to the ballet or the opera. I'll go with her, and you know what? That's the group I really want to hook. You talk about, that's like fishing for that hard to catch species. That's the hard to catch one. When I've got an audience in the outdoors, I'm looking at that person that looks bored, silly, and like they were forced to come out there for the day. That's who I want them to come along. I know the others, a lot of them are already there. They'll come along. So we're continually trying to move people up through this continuum. And social science research says we can do that. Now I want to tie back into this part where we said that it's mission-based. And from my point of view, interpretation is management. You can arrest people. Think about the advocacy that bills to write somebody a $100 or $500 ticket or take their car away from them or their gun or their boat or whatever. You can clean up after them. You can find the mess they created and clean it up, maintenance. You can be a researcher. You can research it. You can study what damage they did to the environment. Those are all important values in what we do. But interpretation is the area where we're involved in the human dimensions of resource management because we manage people. Managing resources is fairly easy. I mean, I know there's a lot to learn and there's a lot to do, but the resources behave predictably. People, we need to become better and better cognitive psychologists and students of how people behave and why they behave that way. And we need to apply that to try to achieving our mission goals and objectives and measurable results. We teach logic models in everything we do in interpretation now. And how many of you have heard of logic models? Okay, about half, it's good. Guess what? Some of the biggest foundations in the United States, Kellogg Foundation, David and Lucille Packard Foundation, require a logic model with your application for their money. NOAA does, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Agency. And in that logic model, they want to know what impact do you say you're going to achieve? What kind of behavioral changes will achieve those impacts, and what are your efforts, your outputs to get them? I want to take an example. The Yosemite Bear Aware program, which actually Bear Aware is throughout North America, but Yosemite's been an area that Sam Hamm and Brenda Lackey from University of Wisconsin's Stevens Point have studied the bear aware problem in Yosemite. The impact they wanted is they were putting down as many as sometimes 12 and 13 bears a year that were problem bears, bears that had been transported and they'd come right back to the campground. And they were getting $2 million a year in auto damage with bears breaking into cars. And so that's the impact they wanted. They wanted to quit killing the bears. Not a lot of fun to go into a campground and there's a bear in the trash barrel and shoot it and drag it out with families watching. And you're destroying the resource you're there to protect. And it's not a lot of fun to fill out incident reports for a person whose $28,000 automobile is now a $2,000 automobile due to a bear's evening with the Twinkies in the back seat. What do you need is change in behavior. We need them to store their food in bear-proof boxes. You need them to sign the pledge at the campground that says, I know that leaving food in my car or campsite will create problems. I will not do it. There's been evidence through research that people who sign these pledges take it seriously and do attempt to do the right thing. It's not foolproof, but it indicates that there's some effort in that way. What kind of outputs do you have to do? This is what we do. Well, we've got to put our bear aware messages everywhere. Actually, at Yosemite, they've got them on those thermal cups that you buy to get coffee in. They've got them on posters. They got them on trail signs. They have it on the newspaper they give you when you enter the park. You've got to put it everywhere. You have to have the bear-proof boxes so people have a place to get their food into safety. Signs on trails, sign the pledge forms. This is what a logic model looks like. And if you'll notice the outputs, the effort that we put in to get a few behavioral changes, to get a very few impacts, it goes down in number. We have to do a lot of different things in terms of media choices in our planning of experiences to result in some behavioral change. Now, Sam Hamm, in his research, a lot of his research has been on how do you make interpretation effective. And he is a cognitive psychologist. Some of the things he says are, you might go, oh yeah, that makes sense. And some of it may be counterintuitive. People remember themes, they forget facts. What he means by that, he says, if you say that your objective is that you want people to remember the 3 ways in which glaciation changed this valley, a week later, a very small percentage of your audience will remember that. A month later, none of them will remember it. They may remember your theme. This valley was formed millions of years ago by glaciers. They may, or tens of thousands of years ago. That they'll remember, but the facts they'll forget. And yet, I see interpretive objectives for exhibits and for programs all the time that are about remembering information. That's great over in that school program Jim talked about, where there actually is a science curriculum and the motivation is graduating to the next grade and getting a better grade on the science statewide scores. But guess what? With the general public, if it's not thematic, they have no way to carry away your ideas. The theme is like a giant basket. They can put all your facts in and they can leave with it. Sam points out that getting that connection with somebody is like putting a Velcro spot on their brain. Then every time they hear a fact related to that, they will retain it. But until you create that Velcro spot, nothing's going to happen. Because we hear information all day that bounces off. I can't use it, I can't use it. I don't know what it's for. Our job is to provoke thought. If you do deep research about what influences people's attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors, it's they have to think. When you think about things deeply, you do two things. You have conversations with yourself, and you have conversations with others. I can't change your behavior. Can't be done. If you think I can change your behavior, I have to think about how hard it is to change my own behavior. But I can influence your attitudes, beliefs, and behavior, and you will change your own behavior if I can get you to understand the resource enough to appreciate how profoundly you can affect it by what you do. But I got to get you to think. If I'm successful, you will retain less information. Now, this flies in the face of everything you've probably been taught. Sam says recent studies in cognitive psychology suggest that if I get you to think, and if I get you deeply provoked into thought about the resource, you will do more poorly on the test than someone else in terms of information. But a month later, when I ask you attitudinal questions, you'll show some shift. You'll begin to care. So when you're testing for information, you're trying to find out whether people retain how many species of fish are found in this lake, how many geese are found on this refuge. They're less capable if you actually did a good job. We can influence people's attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors, but it's all about getting them to think deeply about the resource. Does it matter? I'll tell you what, he did a study with Lindblad Expeditions in the Galapagos Islands where they said, we're not getting many donations for the Darwin Research Station. We don't know why. He looked at their program and he said, you know, it's not thematic. People have no way to connect with this. He helped them design themes that were very strong connections to the Galapagos Islands resources. And they started testing again. They increased donations to Darwin Station tenfold, 10 times as much money. Dramatic change. People left with a real understanding of the importance of the research they were doing in the Galapagos and why it mattered to the future of the world. But it took a real interpretive effort writing strong themes. It did not happen by giving people more and better information. Jim.
And as I know you're probably still thinking about that. Well, if I'm doing a good job, people learn less. It's like, But remember that we are, and I would submit to be more effective, we need to change how people feel, even more than what they know. Because if people walk away and a month later, 3 months, 6 months later, a year later, they go, wow, you know, there are amazing places with dedicated people taking care of my resources, and I need to support them. Not a lot of information there, but what you've done is now they have a feel for your places and who you are and what you do, and for the mission of the Fish and Wildlife Service. And we found over and over again that when you change how people feel, that stays with them and they are more likely to act on it, which is perhaps the most important part. I can give you an example from the marine realm because I've been in the fish business now for a number of years. And in 1999, we did a nationwide study called the Oceans Project and repeated it again 10 years later. And both times came up with the same results. And this was an in-depth interview with over 600 people, randomly selected, so pretty high level of confidence in the results. And there were 3 scales that we had. One of them was a scale on how much you knew about the ocean, how much factual information you had about the ocean. Another scale was your connection to the ocean, and in terms of things like my family used to go on vacations to the shore regularly, or I used to take my kids tide pooling, or things that you had done, things that that were indicators of maybe having that personal connection, an emotional connection to the ocean. I find the ocean beautiful. I go there to relax. I go there to get centered. And the third scale was the kind of an ocean action scale. Do you do beach cleanups? Do you belong to a ocean conservation organization? And on up, do you write letters to your legislative representatives about ocean policy and legislation? And what we found, both those studies repeated 10 years apart, was that people could score very high on the ocean information scale, and there was no correlation between the information and that ocean action scale. If there was a very high correlation between that emotional connection scale and the action scale, that if there was a personal connection, oftentimes they had a deep affinity for ocean resources, they were more likely to actually take action. Not just to know about, but to care about and to take action. And more, that's part of the business that we are in. We talked about delivering conservation to the American public. If we're the only people that are taking conservation action, it's not going to work. They need to join us in taking action. And that comes from making that deeper connection, the emotional connection. You can't educate somebody into taking action. It's that old saying about education, education is something you do to people that don't agree with you. We want people not only to agree with us, but we want them to follow us in taking action. And that really comes from that emotional connection piece. That's why I keep coming back to that. So, introducing people firsthand experiences, that's tough. There's only a few of us and there's a whole lot of public out there. But you know, we don't have to do this alone. We can do this with a lot of volunteers. And I've been hearing more and more all week long about the role of volunteers in what we do. And those are people that are donating their time, their most precious resource, to help you out, to further the cause. Why not harness that passion? Oh, passion's an intangible, isn't it? Why not harness that to help those people connect audiences to our places and our resources? There's a whole army out there willing to jump in with us. We take good advantage of it.
So what's the answer to my question? I asked at the beginning. C, yeah. Interestingly, there's actually sometimes an inverse relationship when people's knowledge increases with their love for the subject. Think about it. We force you to take a test to become a driver of an automobile. I don't know that it makes you passionate about driving laws and about automobile regulations. We use the motivation that we're not going to let you drive it if you don't pass the test. There's all sorts of things we do to increase people's knowledge, and as Jim pointed out, what we really are going for is that change in people's behavior, but guess what? We can't change them. That's not what we do. We influence their attitudes, beliefs, and behavior. And it's not propaganda. We call that interpropaganda. It's not about fooling them or hypnotizing them into doing something different. It's about simply helping them understand, because most of us became stewards through a deeper understanding of how the world works and why it matters that we participate in that. They'll do the same. But again, the social science research supports that. We have to trust them to do that. Now, Jim threw this in. This is the official seals of approval for interpretation. And, well, they speak for themselves. I guess what we'd like to suggest to you is you can plan to make a difference through great interpretation of your refuge. And when we say you can plan to make a difference, I would tell you that our interpretive planners course, if you come to it, you spend the mornings learning the concepts about interpretive planning. In the afternoon, we break you into 3-person groups, and you write an interpretive plan in 4 days and present it on the 5th day. People who take the course call it interpretive planning boot camp because they're up late Thursday night getting that written plan and that presentation figured out. But at the end of the week, they have confidence that they can write an interpretive plan. Interpretive planning is about designing experiences. Very often, biologists, scientists, historians, cultural people are great at giving the heart of the program, but they fail to design a good experience. Because the experience starts with the decision people make to come and visit you, the entry experience, what it's like arriving, what it's like during the actual experience, what it's like as they're leaving the place, and then the commitment. Did we influence their attitudes, beliefs, and behavior? And so visitor experience design is a major focus of the planning courses. Next one's in Saskatchewan at a national park. It's a really interesting one. We're doing the Certified Interpretive Trainers course in St. Louis. There's a few open seats left, August 22 to 26th. This is where we train your staff to certify interpretive guides amongst your staff or volunteers or fringe group or whoever. And that program, anyone here a certified interpretive trainer? I know some of the hands that are going to go up, so I'm looking for those. I think you'll find it's an effective program. We've certified over 12,000 interpretive guides in the last 10 years in the United States, and people who are using the program actively tell us it really works. In fact, Monterey Bay Aquarium is one of our most active advocates for the program. Let me say that we brought with us, I'm going to turn this over to Jim, and we're going to invite some questions and chat with you. But I'm going to place copies of our Legacy magazine at the back of the room. This one's on sustainable recreation and tourism. There's another one in here on interpreting food, not the usual thing you expect when you see a bison on the cover. And I have brochures that tell you more about National Association for Interpretation. So we'll put those on the back table you can grab on your way out. Jim?
Questions that I just have. This is the refuge I grew up with in the middle of downtown Oakland.
We need to get the microphone too.
And yeah, actually, let's, or I can bring the mic around to folks if you've got a question. If you don't have a question, I'm going to keep talking. So questions, thoughts, comments, rude remarks? Good.
I work in a program that is called Partners for Fish and Wildlife. And while, you know, we can learn this stuff to have people come to our refuges and learn stuff, you know, whatever we're trying to communicate. But is there a program or is there something on the web or something that somebody like myself, who when I'm taking a group of people out who are interested in what we've done with the landowner or how we're affecting the landscape on a broader level other than just that private land, is there some kind of training course that we can go to that would, because I always see this stuff as that you're bringing somebody to a central place, whereas we're going out satellite all over the place with this kind of stuff. And I think that's where we lack in being able to communicate that emotional side of things to people. We don't have the ability to have that set up. So do you have any advice for that?
There's, and Tim may have some thoughts too, a couple of things. First of all, from the, and I'm not sure if you're asking about the training side or just working with your clients and your audience. And so creating kind of a web presence that may also be an asset in helping to connect with a far-flung audience. And there are more and more web-based kinds of programs, that emotional connection piece, which is a real challenge. It works most effectively on an interpersonal basis. But sometimes there's some other assets in terms of when you look at things that we humans have done just to try and express some of these universals like beauty, and sometimes other media, or the internet, and I think that's one of the weaknesses of the internet is really trying to make those emotional connections.
Yeah, I agree with you, but having said that, we're stuck with this. Sometimes we have to have some of these other resources as our contact. I will tell you what the Association of Fundraising Professionals will tell you from research that's done on a global scale in this. They take organizations that raise money for HIV and hunger and all of these big issues globally, especially in Africa. And one of the things they found is if you design an interpretive story on the internet or in an ad that says 100,000 girls in this Mumbai, India, are under 13 are prostitutes on the street. They're helping feed their families, and you give all the facts about those girls' lives. And then they test that against Shalila Indra is an 11-year-old girl. Her father sold her into slavery to become a prostitute to help feed his children. Isn't there a better way that we can take care of people's families? When they test those two things, the second one, the emotional appeal with the personal story, is 10 times as effective. And so if you transfer that to our media, we got to quit listing the facts and thinking that that carries the day, and we've got to start telling these individual stories. I mean, you just listen to Juan Martinez. How much more powerful is it for him to get up there and say, this is where I grew up? And getting to see nature up close and have these real experiences at Teton changed my life. How much more powerful is that than giving people statistics on how many Latino kids from LA get to go to camp or get to go to Teton Science Institute? And yet our natural inclination as scientists is to fall back on the data. We have to start where people are, make it relate to their lives, and get them emotionally connected, as Jim points out. And whether we're using a hot medium like interpersonal communication, how many volunteers do you have?
We're over 1,200 now.
1,200. I'm aware that many of you are in rural areas where it's hard for you to have 1,200 volunteers, but whatever number of volunteers you have, they extend your ability to use a warm medium like interpersonal communication. But if you need those internet-based, web-based solutions, get into interpretive planning so that you're making better decisions about what kind of experience you create on the internet. Because again, the research with the fundraising professionals is that you can have impact with pretty ephemeral contacts with ads and with internet.
I can tell you at the aquarium, I get this time of the year about 8,000 visitors a day. On our website, 80,000 a day. So the reach of web is amazing. And I agree with Tim, personal stories are always so compelling. And with digital storytelling, there's more and more expertise in how to present those stories via the internet.
Think about, how many of you saw the Kruger National Park thing where the crocodiles grabbed the baby Cape buffalo, and then the lions got it from the other side, and then the adults charged in it? Battle at Kruger. How many of you saw that on YouTube? Well, you and 150 million other people saw that. That was one 4 or 5 minute clip put on YouTube. If we were better at developing these 2 to 4 minute clips of dramatic stories at wildlife refuges, I mean, that was a lucky one that someone videoed, but we could be designing videos that capture really important individual stories at wildlife refuges and get them on YouTube. If they go viral, they contact an audience on a level that we couldn't hope to reach in other ways. And of course, the ultimate message at the end of the video could be, come and visit us at Crab Orchard National Wildlife Refuge or wherever.
I just wanted to say that when you talk about your certified interpretive guide training and certified interpretive host training, it's not just for interpreters. And I would like you to speak about that because you can speak. I just want to hear what you have to say about that, Tim.
Okay, an interesting thing happened. Texas Parks and Wildlife said, we're using your guide program, but guess what? Most of our employees who talk to the public don't give presentations. What can you do for them? They said they're maintenance workers, they're cashiers, receptionists, whatever. We said, well, we could design an interpretive host course that helps teach people two things. Every conversation with the public is a chance to make a connection. And the second one is, the mission of the organization is everybody's job one. And they said, we'll pay you to develop that course. So we developed it. And our certified interpretive trainers like Cindy and Jim and various others of you can deliver that host course. It's 2-day training. When we first tested it in East Texas with a bunch of maintenance workers who had worked for East Texas Parks for 30 years, hardcore bunch of guys, I have to say. One guy said at the beginning of the 2 days, he said, the only reason I came here is I don't have to clean toilets for 2 days. At the end of 2 days, he said, this is the first time in my 25 years here that I feel like a professional member of the park staff. His boss came up later and said, you know, I've known him 25 years. I didn't realize that he was a scholar of Caddo Indians and that he was a flint knapper at home. We marginalize a lot of our employees who came to work for us, it would seem, to change tires and to change the oil in the truck and to mow the grass and to plant seed and that sort of thing. They could be working at Walmart or they could be working at a Sears or whatever, but they're working at our place. Giving them a little bit of training and interpretation empowers them to tell their personal story, and it turns every conversation at your site into a chance to connect somebody to the resource. We asked them during that course, as a maintenance worker, what could you do that would help people connect? And these guys would go, well, you know, on a holiday, I could get out there a little earlier in the morning and clean up the area where people park to watch sunrise or sunset or whatever, so that they don't find the raccoons turned over the trash barrels and scattered trash everywhere. Sometimes we don't get to that till 11 or 12 o'clock in the day. I ought to be getting there earlier. They came up with the solutions, but they had to talk about their role in the human dimensions of resource management. Jim, do you use that program?
We do. We use both the host training for like our security staff and admission staff, and then we use certified interpretive guide training for most of the rest of the staff and a lot of our volunteers that connect with folks as well.
We have one more question and then we're out of time and want to respect the time limitation, get you to lunch.
I just want to say there's probably enough of us in the room that remember when in this agency when we were 023s, and I think we need to celebrate some of the tremendous successes we've had in getting more visitor services professionals into the agency. But I think what we have to remember, what comes with that, there's a danger that we depend on those people. That's their job. It's not everybody's job. And it's, just a reminder, it is everybody's job. We just went through a new visitor center project and doing the exhibits and everything. And I think Maggie O'Connell will agree that we have a pretty Class A project that we're very proud of. I said, we wouldn't have that if we didn't have the engagement from all levels of the staff on a refuge into that product to get to where we are.
I think that's great. I can tell you that Kevin Kilcullen and we have been chatting about how to get more of the interpretive guide and host training into Fish and Wildlife Service. And we're looking for strategies. We're going to bring the trainer's course back to NCTC for the second time. It's been there once already, but we're going to bring it back again, hopefully next year. So if that's your preferred location to go to train, you will see this trainer's course appear there. Well, thank you for your kind attention. Jim's around for a couple days. I'm around till 5 o'clock today if we can be of any help. chatting with you individually, we'll sure do that. And please feel free to pick up a magazine or a brochure at the back of the room.
Thank you.